Well, I'd like to thank you so much for coming to see me today, although I must confess, I should not even be speaking to you. You see, I'm not even buried here at Springdale Cemetery, but he is. My name is Clarissa Wren, and hi, welcome. I have a story to tell you that, well, my mother taught me not to be a talebearer, and so I'm not sure if I should tell you this story. She would roll over in her grave to hear the scandal and the outrage and the gossip that went on, but you see, I understand that you kind folks are interested in hearing about Mr. Abraham Lincoln, and the man saved my life. And so I will tell you this story, even though my mother is probably rolling over in her grave. I was once very happy in Peoria. I was married to Aquila Wren, that scoundrel. I mean, how could he? I truly loved him for a time. How could he? Aquila, perhaps you've heard of Aquila. He was actually very well known in Peoria. He owned a dry goods store, and over the course of our 18 years of marriage, he did very well. Our store grew and prospered, and actually he was able to purchase a great deal of land in Peoria. And we lived a pretty nice life. And then he had an affair. He had an affair with a younger woman. Now, if that was not bad enough, he did not want his precious name destroyed in this community, and so he accused me of having an affair. Because, you see, he wanted a divorce. I was filled with shame, and I was so scandalized. You see, none of my friends had ever gone through anything like this. He wanted to divorce me. And so I found myself in the horrible predicament of having to hire a lawyer to defend myself. So I hired Mr. Elihu Powell, who you will be meeting, and Aquila, well, he hired Mr. Norman Purple. You will also be meeting him. And, well, the trial began. There I was, being accused of having an affair, when it was him. And the jury, of all men, believed it. They believed his story, not mine. Aquila won the case, and I was turned out, homeless and penniless, without a thing. And just when I thought that the fates had dealt a terrible blow, Aquila died. Right in the middle of the proceedings, Aquila died. Well, I know it's very sad. Very, very sad. I was filled with sadness. Well, he's actually buried here at Springdale Cemetery. And my lawyer, Mr. Elihu Powell, saw the opportunity to reopen my case, and he took it. He went to the Illinois State Supreme Court, and he appealed to them to reopen my case because, you see, some of the details had not yet been finalized, and, well, we decided to hire Mr. Abraham Lincoln to defend me. Now, I was very surprised that Mr. Lincoln would want to take on this case. You see, defending a woman, women had no rights, very few rights to speak of in those days, and divorce was so uncommon. But I have it on good authority, in fact, Mr. Lincoln's partner, Mr. Billy Herndon, that Mr. Lincoln was a suffragette. He was a supporter of women's rights, possibly owing to the feistiness of his own wife, Mary Todd. Oh, my goodness me. But in any case, Mr. Lincoln read through my file and decided that he would take the case. He wanted to see justice done. So, he began with a defense that was very unusual, and in fact is why you may have heard my name. He determined that this was not an issue of whether a divorce should be granted or not, or who was at fault. It was an issue of property rights. Property rights. For a woman to have rights to a man's property was unheard of. Unthinkable. But that was the approach that Mr. Lincoln took. And so, he issued a writ of scrie facias, which is a legal term. I'm not a lawyer. I don't know if any of you are, but I've written this down for you because I want to say it exactly right. This was very unheard of, but it saved my life. A writ of scrie facias. A legal order for the person or persons against whom it is brought to appear before the court and show why the record should not be resolved in favor of the person or persons who issued the writ. Ingenious? I didn't know what it meant. But here's what he did. Mr. Lincoln brought all of the all of the people who stood to inherit from Mr. Wren onto the judge's stand to explain why I should not be given a portion of the property. It was highly unusual, but we succeeded. We won the case, and I am one of the very first women to be issued a share of my husband's property. I was able to begin my life again. I took the money, I left Peoria, I left the gossip and the scandal behind, I remarried, and I moved forward with my life. And none of this would have happened if not for the genius of Mr. Abraham Lincoln. But I understand from others that Mr. Lincoln really had a soft spot for the downtrodden and those who were treated unjustly. In fact, my favorite case involving Mr. Lincoln, some of you may have heard of the case of Melissa Goings from Metamora, Illinois. Well, Miss Melissa Goings, as the story goes, was an elderly woman, and please appreciate that as I get older, so does elderly. I used to think 40 was old. Well, she was 70, so late middle age, shall we say. And her husband knocked her to the ground, sat on her chest, grabbed her by the throat, and began screaming at her, "I am going to kill you!" Well, she believed him, and she reached around for whatever she could find. She grabbed a large stick of firewood, and she hit him on the head with it. He died, and she was now on trial and facing a possible hanging for his death. So Mr. Lincoln agreed to take that case. Now, he started off with a standard approach. He said to the jury of all men, again, "Gentlemen, I am confident that she did not mean to kill her husband. They were married for 50 years. Surely she loved the man." Frankly, in my opinion, a woman shouldn't have to endure that kind of treatment, but never mind my opinion. He looked into the face of all of the jury and he said, "It is wrong for a man to beat his wife." And he went on about the sins of spousal abuse. But as he looked into their faces, he could see that he was not swaying them, because under the law, a man had every right to beat his wife as often as he wanted. He was protected by the law. It was expected. So he could see that he was not swaying any of the jury, but he also knew that he did not want to lose this case. And so Mr. Lincoln, in his brilliance, looked into the eyes of the jury and said, "This is a case of self-defense." Well, you could hear the gasp. Defense? A woman defending herself against a man? A woman had no rights. So he said to them, as I'm saying to you, put yourself in her shoes. If somebody knocked you to the ground, sat on your chest, grabbed you by the throat, and screamed, "I am going to kill you," would you believe them? Would you defend yourself? Well, he looked into the eyes of the jury again, and of course they were still not being swayed, although they were probably a little uncomfortable, maybe shifting in their seats, possibly thinking of how they treated their own wives. Well, Mr. Lincoln could see that under the law, he needed to speak with his client privately, because the law did not protect in these cases. So he asked the jury, "Could I please have some time alone with my client?" And the judge said yes. And Mr. Lincoln and Melissa Goings exited the courtroom. Now, if you've ever been to the Metamora courthouse, it's on right in front of a beautiful park area. So everybody filed out of the courtroom and out into that beautiful park. And several hours later, they came back into the courtroom, and Mr. Lincoln began to speak again to the jury about the sins of spousal abuse. But Melissa Goings was not with him. So the judge interrupted and said, "Mr. Lincoln, did you instruct your client to flee?" Mr. Lincoln said, "Sir, if I were to instruct my client to flee, I could be disbarred. I did not instruct my client to flee." He turned back to the jury and again began to speak about the sins of spousal abuse, going on and on, often repeating himself. I believe I am too. And finally the judge interrupted him a second time and said, "Mr. Lincoln, if you did not instruct your client to flee, exactly what did you say to your client?" Mr. Lincoln, he leaned back as only Mr. Lincoln would do and said, "Well, sir, Melissa Goings expressed to me that she was thirsty, and all I said is, I understand there's some mighty fine drinking water in the state of Tennessee." Melissa Goings was gone, never to be seen again in Illinois. Well, thank you so much for hearing my story today. If you could please do me a favor and not talk about divorce, I would appreciate it. I just wanted you to hear about Mr. Lincoln. Thank you.